A young black student steps onto a luxury flight, holding a business class ticket, excited for a journey that should have been just another step toward his bright future. But the moment he enters the cabin, the looks begin. Eyes scan him up and down, not with curiosity, but with doubt. Some passengers whisper. Some pretend not to see him at all. And some, they make sure he knows he doesn't belong. Meet Zyair Coleman, 17 years old, smart, ambitious, and completely unaware that this flight will become a test of endurance, dignity, and power. He's not just here to travel. He's about to experience something far worse than turbulence. From cruel remarks disguised as politeness to small but deliberate humiliations, Zaire finds himself outnumbered and outmatched by people who believe they can crush him without consequence. But what they don't know, they're playing a game they've already lost. This isn't just a story. This is a reckoning, a slow-burning humiliation that ends in the most satisfying twist imaginable. What would you do in Zaire's situation? Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Don't miss what happens next. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the ultimate downfall. Zyair Coleman walked up to the airline check-in counter, gripping his passport and boarding pass tightly. The airport was busy, the air filled with the low hum of conversations, rolling suitcases, and occasional flight announcements. Despite his usual confidence, a small pit formed in his stomach as he stepped forward. He had experienced situations like this before, and today didn't feel any different. The airline employee at the counter, a woman in her late 40s with a neatly pinned-up bun and a forced corporate smile, glanced at Zaire, then at his boarding pass. The moment her eyes landed on the words business class, her expression changed. The smile remained, but there was a flicker of hesitation, a narrowing of her eyes, as if she needed to reassess the situation. Business class? She repeated, tilting her head slightly. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she let out a small chuckle, barely audible over the airport noise. That's an interesting ticket. Zaire didn't react immediately. He had learned long ago that reacting too soon could escalate things in ways he didn't want. "Yes, ma'am," he said, keeping his voice calm and even. "Is there an issue?" She exhaled sharply, her smile thinning. "It's just, we don't often see young travelers in business class, especially, well..." She stopped mid-sentence, as if catching herself, before clearing her throat and continuing. "Did someone purchase this for you?" Zaire's fingers clenched slightly around his passport. "I did." The woman let out a small, knowing hum. "Oh, I see. You must be very lucky." Her voice dripped with condescension, her fingers clicking across the keyboard. Zaire kept his face neutral, though his patience was thinning. As she typed, a man in a suit walked past, handing over his business class ticket. She barely glanced at his pass before printing his boarding pass and offering him a cheerful, "Enjoy your flight, sir." When she turned back to Zaire, her expression had changed again, something between mild suspicion and irritation, as if his mere presence at her counter was an inconvenience. She pursed her lips, tapped a few more keys, then frowned. Looks like there's been a little mix-up," she announced, not looking at him, but at the screen. Zaire's brows furrowed. "A mix-up?" "Yes," she said, still avoiding eye contact. "It seems your seat assignment has changed. You've been rebooked into economy." Zaire inhaled slowly. He glanced down at his boarding pass, the perfectly printed business class label still visible. He looked back up at her, reading her expression carefully. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. "That's strange," he said, keeping his voice measured. "My ticket was booked weeks ago. Paid in full. I even checked in online." The woman gave a nonchalant shrug. "Yes, well, sometimes the system automatically corrects seat assignments based on availability." Zaire's jaw tightened, but he refused to let his frustration show. "So what happened to my seat?" The woman sighed, tapping her fingers against the desk. "It was reassigned to another passenger." "Who?" Another dismissive shrug. "Sir, I don't have that information. But look, economy still gets you to the same destination, right?" She smiled again, but this time it was pure mockery. Zaire didn't smile back. He wanted to argue, wanted to demand that she print the correct boarding pass and acknowledge the injustice happening in real time. But he knew how these situations played out. If he pushed too hard, he'd become a disruptive passenger. If he raised his voice, security would be called. If he didn't comply, he might not make the flight at all. So instead, he exhaled through his nose and forced himself to nod. "Fine," he said, voice flat. The woman smirked, printing his economy boarding pass and sliding it across the counter. "Glad we could clear that up," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "Have a nice flight." As he turned to walk away, he could feel the weight of unseen stares, the unspoken question lingering in the air. Did he really think he belonged up there? The terminal was filled with travelers moving effortlessly through the spacious lounges, the quiet hum of privilege settling over the business class section like an invisible barrier. Zaire walked toward the entrance of the VIP lounge, his fingers still gripping the flimsy economy boarding pass he'd been forced to accept. Maybe he could at least sit somewhere comfortable before boarding. A young receptionist at the lounge entrance barely looked up as a white couple ahead of him strolled in, their conversation drowned in polite laughter. When Zaire stepped forward, she finally acknowledged him, her eyes flickering with immediate skepticism. "Boarding pass, please," she said. Zaire handed it over, and for a moment, her polite facade remained intact, until her eyes caught the economy class stamp. Her smile flattened. She looked at him properly for the first time, scanning his hoodie, his sneakers, and his dark skin as if seeing all the proof she needed. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, handing the pass back too quickly. "This lounge is for business class and first class passengers only." Zaire stared at her, his pulse tightening. "I had a business class ticket. It was reassigned without my consent." Her brows lifted slightly in mock sympathy. "That's unfortunate." A beat. Then, with a practiced finality, "But we can only admit passengers based on their current ticket class." Zaire wanted to argue, to point out that this was his rightful access, that he was only here because of an intentional malicious mix-up. But he already knew the look in her eyes. There was no room for negotiation. "Understood," he muttered, stepping aside. As he turned away, he caught a glance from an older, white man seated near the entrance. The man smirked slightly, tapping his fingers against his knee, as if he'd been waiting for this exact outcome. Zaire's stomach clenched, but he forced himself to walk past without reacting. He found a seat near the general waiting area, a row of cold metal chairs bolted to the ground, positioned directly beside a janitor station where the scent of industrial cleaner mixed with the stale odor of a nearby trash bin. Every few minutes, a staff member would roll up, dump another bag into the bin, and walk away without a second glance. Zaire shifted uncomfortably, the distant sound of clinking glass and soft jazz music from the lounge a cruel reminder of what he'd been shut out of. Across from him, a mother in a designer coat pulled her daughter closer, whispering something while glancing at him. The little girl looked up confused, before letting her gaze linger on Zaire's face like he was some kind of puzzle she didn't understand. He focused on his phone, pretending not to notice. 30 minutes passed, but it felt longer. A few business class passengers drifted past, and every time, they gave him the same subtle, dismissive glance, as if they were surprised he hadn't left yet. A male airport worker arrived, wheeling a fresh cart of trash bags. He stopped near Zaire's seat, paused, then gestured toward the space beside him. "Hey, kid, mind moving over? Need to get to the bin." Zaire blinked. The entire row of chairs was empty except for him. The worker could have placed the bags anywhere, could have maneuvered around him without a word. But he chose to make a point. For a second, Zaire considered ignoring him, refusing to move just to reclaim a sliver of control. But he knew how this played out. If he resisted, it would turn into something bigger. Security would be involved. Words like non-compliant and hostile would be thrown around. So he stood up, stepped aside, and let the man dump the trash right where he'd been sitting. As the worker walked away, Zaire let out a slow breath, swallowing the bitterness rising in his throat. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of reacting. He wouldn't. The business class cabin exuded an effortless luxury. The polished leather seats, the clinking of glassware, the soft murmur of casual conversations among passengers who knew they belonged here. He had barely taken 2 steps inside when a voice, smooth yet edged with something sharper, cut through the air. Well, now this is unusual. Zaire looked up. The speaker was Brian Sterling, the head flight attendant, a man in his mid-50s with slick silver hair and the kind of polished authority that didn't need to be stated. His uniform was pristine, his posture impeccable, and yet it was the way he looked at Zaire, eyes slowly dragging from his sneakers to his hoodie, to his face. That said everything. Bryant's lips curled into a practiced smile as he turned slightly to a nearby flight attendant and spoke just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. We don't usually see economy passengers wandering up front. Zaire tightened his grip on his backpack. His fingers twitched slightly against the worn fabric, but his voice remained neutral. I'm not in economy. My seat is for A. Bryant's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Really, he exaggerated the act of checking the boarding pass, pausing just long enough to make it feel like an investigation. Then, with a slow nod, he handed it back. Looks like the system really is broken today. A quiet ripple of chuckles floated from a few rows back. Zaire turned slightly, his gaze landing on Howard Calloway, the businessman from the lounge. Howard smirked over the rim of his whiskey glass, his eyes gleaming with a kind of knowing satisfaction. Zaire's pulse throbbed in his ears, but he forced his feet forward. As he moved past Bryant, the flight attendant didn't step aside immediately, blocking his path for a fraction too long before finally shifting with a slow, deliberate motion. "Oh," he said, feigning surprise. "Was I in the way? My apologies." The air around Zaire felt thicker as he made his way down the aisle, eyes scanning for a seat, but he could still feel the stares pressing into his back. He tried to ignore them, tried to focus on just getting to his spot, but then another voice rang out, one laced with carefully measured sweetness. "Oh dear," sighed Lauren Whitmore, the elegantly dressed woman in 4B, her voice carrying just enough volume to be overheard. "I was really hoping for a pleasant flight." Her husband, Derek, lowered his newspaper slightly. "What's wrong?" Lauren tilted her head toward Zaire, but didn't look at him directly, as if acknowledging him would be beneath her. "Nothing, darling," she murmured, voice dripping with exaggerated patience. "I just wasn't expecting to sit so close to someone so underdressed." Derek hummed as he scanned Zaire briefly before returning to his newspaper. Maybe the airline started offering discount programs, he mused. Lauren let out a soft, polite laugh, the kind exchanged at country clubs over cocktails. Zaire exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing his hands to remain still as he placed his bag beneath his seat. He wouldn't give them a reaction. A low chuckle sounded from across the aisle. Howard swirled the whiskey in his glass before grinning. "Kid looks like he should be pushing snack carts, not sitting in business class." The words hit their mark with brutal precision. Zaire's entire body locked up, the heat rising up his neck despite every effort to stay unaffected. He could feel Lauren's barely concealed smirk, Derek's disinterested amusement, Howard's open glee. A flight attendant, younger than Bryant, stood nearby. Riley Dawson. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, but then she hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she averted her gaze entirely. No one was going to say anything. No one was going to stop it. Zaire sat down, his movements stiff, mechanical. The murmurs around him blurred into the hum of the plane, but the weight of them lingered, pressing into his skin like fingerprints that wouldn't fade. His hands gripped the armrests, his knuckles aching with the force of restraint. He couldn't leave, couldn't argue, couldn't push back without it backfiring. The space around him felt smaller, the air heavier. He wasn't a passenger. He wasn't even a person in their eyes. He was an inconvenience, a mistake that had somehow slipped through the cracks of their carefully curated world. His nails dug into his palms, the sting grounding him. There was no escape, no moment of reprieve. He just had to sit there and take it. The whispers had died down, but the atmosphere around him remained suffocating. He could still feel Howard's smirk burning into the side of his face and the occasional glances from Lauren, her expression unreadable but dripping with silent judgment. Every breath Zaire took felt like a fight for space in a cabin where no one wanted him. Just as he tried to settle in, A sudden jolt sent a sharp sting through his arm. He glanced up just in time to see Lauren retracting her elbow from his armrest, her expression blank, but her movements slow, calculated. "Oh," she murmured, feigning surprise. "I didn't see you there." She shifted slightly, reclaiming the armrest without hesitation. Zaire clenched his jaw, but didn't respond. A flight attendant passed by, handing out steaming towels to passengers. When she reached Zaire's row, she barely glanced at him before skipping him entirely, moving on as if he weren't there. The warm scent of eucalyptus filled the air, yet Zaire's hands remained empty, his skin prickling at the omission. Bryant, still hovering near the front of the cabin, took his time checking on other passengers, making small talk, ensuring their comfort. When he finally reached Zaire's row, he leaned down slightly, voice carefully neutral. "Sir, would you mind tucking your backpack a little further under the seat? We wouldn't want it to obstruct anyone's space." Zaire's bag was already positioned neatly beneath the seat, far from intruding on anyone's legroom, but the request wasn't about the bag. It was about control. Zaire bent down, adjusting it unnecessarily, and when he straightened, Bryant was already gone, moving down the aisle without so much as a glance of acknowledgement. The first drink service began. The clinking of glasses and the quiet rustle of menus filled the cabin as the attendants moved efficiently, placing pre-ordered beverages in front of each passenger. When Riley reached Zaire's row, she hesitated for a second too long before giving him a tight-lipped smile. "Would you like something to drink?" Before Zaire could answer, Howard's voice cut through. "I'd be careful, miss. Some of these young ones can't handle the more refined selections." His eyes flicked to Zaire, amusement dancing in them. Zaire kept his expression blank. "Water's fine," he said flatly. Riley nodded, setting down a small bottle and a plastic cup filled with ice. Across the aisle, a flight attendant poured whiskey into Howard's glass, the rich amber liquid swirling against the sides. Zaire tried not to focus on the difference in service, but it was impossible to ignore. Minutes later, a slight movement caught Zaire's attention. Derek, seated on the other side of Lauren, reached for his napkin but accidentally brushed against Zaire's arm in the process, pressing down just hard enough to be noticed. "Oh," Derek muttered, withdrawing his hand lazily. "Didn't realize you were there." The corner of his mouth twitched upward. Zaire inhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the edge of his tray table. His presence was an inconvenience to them, and they wanted to make sure he knew it. A cart rolled by, carrying meal trays covered in gleaming silver lids. The air filled with the aroma of roasted meat and fresh bread, a reminder that despite everything, he still had to sit through an entire flight with these people. One by one, the attendants placed meals in front of each passenger, offering warm smiles and nods. When they reached Zaire, the attendant paused, looking down at her list. "I'm sorry," she said, tone-clipped. "It looks like there was a mistake with your meal selection. We'll check if there's anything left once everyone else has been served." Howard chuckled under his breath. "Guess that's the problem with last-minute upgrades. You get what's left over." The words landed like a slap, but Zaire didn't react. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He wouldn't let them see how tightly his stomach twisted, how dry his throat felt despite the water he had barely touched. As trays were uncovered, rich sauces glistening under the warm cabin lights, Zaire leaned back, staring at the blank screen in front of him. His body ached with tension, his skin prickling under the weight of 100 unspoken words. The weight of unseen eyes bore down on him. Every movement he made scrutinized. Every breath he took a silent invitation for the next attack. He barely had time to process the last blow before the next one came. Lauren shifted in her seat, tilting her head slightly as if studying a specimen. "You know, I was just thinking," she mused, her voice carrying a performative innocence. "He's rather thin, isn't he?" "Not quite what I expected." Derek, still flipping through his newspaper, didn't bother looking up. "Oh." Laura nodded, eyes flicking over Zaire's arms, his shoulders, as if evaluating him like a product on display. "I thought they were supposed to be, I don't know, bigger? More athletic? Maybe I've been watching too many sports documentaries." Howard let out a low chuckle, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Ah yes, that's the problem with generalizations. Every now and then, one slips through the cracks. His smirk deepened as he took a sip. Poor kid must have missed the genetic lottery. Zyair's jaw clenched, his nails pressing into the skin of his palm. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge them. He knew the game. If he reacted even slightly, they would pounce. Derek finally set his newspaper down, glancing at Zaire as if truly noticing him for the first time. "You're 17, aren't you?" Zaire hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Derek arched an eyebrow, exchanging an amused glance with his wife. 17? Huh. Wouldn't have guessed. Looks more like 12. Lauren stifled a laugh behind her perfectly manicured fingers. "Oh, stop it," she scolded playfully, though the glint in her eyes betrayed her amusement. "It's not his fault. Some people just develop later than others." Howard chuckled. "Well, with his build, I'd be worried about strong winds. One bad gust, and poof." He flicked his fingers dramatically. Zaire's hands curled into fists beneath the tray table, his breath shallow. His body felt too small in the vast expanse of the cabin, every inch of him analyzed and picked apart like he was some anomaly that didn't quite fit. Then came the next hit. Howard leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his whiskey glass dangling carelessly from his fingers. "I have to ask, kid, you said you're 17. Must mean you're headed to college soon?" Zaire hesitated again. He knew exactly where this was going, but staying silent would only make it worse. "Yes." Howard feigned interest. "Really? Which one?" Zaire swallowed the bitterness in his throat. "Brentford University." For the first time, Derek's head lifted fully, genuine surprise flashing across his face before it was quickly replaced with mild skepticism. Lauren's brows lifted, and Howard exhaled sharply through his nose, amusement dripping from every inch of his posture. "Brentford?" Derek repeated, as if he had misheard. Lauren let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Well, that's unexpected." Howard grinned. "No offense, kid, but how exactly does that happen?" Zaire felt the shift in the air, the momentary silence before the real blow landed. Howard leaned back in his seat, tilting his glass slightly. "Affirmative action." "Huh?" The words hung between them, sharp and cutting. A thinly veiled accusation wrapped in feigned curiosity. Derek hummed thoughtfully. "That would explain it." Laura nodded. Makes sense." Howard chuckled again, shaking his head. "Nothing wrong with a little push in the right direction. I mean, we all want diversity, don't we?" His grin widened. "Even if it means letting a few through the gates who wouldn't have made it otherwise." Zaire forced himself to remain still. His heart pounded against his ribs, his nails digging crescents into his palms. They weren't asking him a question. They weren't looking for an answer. They had already decided the truth, and no matter what he said, no matter how he tried to prove himself, it wouldn't matter. His acceptance, his achievements, his intelligence, none of it existed in their eyes. To them, he was just a statistical obligation, a box checked off to meet a quota. The cabin was filled with quiet laughter, low murmurs of agreement. Zaire stared at the screen in front of him, his vision blurring slightly. Lauren shifted in her seat, her elbow bumping against Zaire's arm for the second time that evening. Unlike before, she didn't retract immediately. Instead, she pressed just slightly harder before finally sighing and withdrawing as if touching him was a personal inconvenience. "Oh, dear," she murmured, reaching for a cloth napkin and dabbing at her elbow, like she had brushed against something unclean. Derek glanced up, feigning amusement. "You all right, darling?" Lauren let out a delicate laugh. "I suppose I should be more careful." Her voice was light casual, but the implication was razor sharp. Howard took another sip of his drink, watching the exchange with interest. It's tricky when you're not used to sharing space with unexpected guests. Zaire clenched his jaw but refused to engage. If he responded, even with a glance, they would twist it into something worse. He stared ahead, trying to focus on the in-flight screen, but the next attack came just as swiftly. The dinner service continued. Flight attendants moved gracefully between rows, setting down trays with practiced ease. The scent of roasted meat and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the soft clink of wine glasses. Riley, the only attendant who had shown even the slightest hesitation toward this treatment, approached Zaire's row with a tray in hand. Just as she was about to place it in front of him, Bryant appeared beside her, stopping her with a light touch on her wrist. "Oh," he said smoothly, his voice carrying an air of casual authority. "It looks like there was a mistake with the meal selection here. This one wasn't accounted for." Riley hesitated, her grip tightening slightly on the tray before she quickly masked her reaction. Bryant smiled, a gesture so polished it was almost rehearsed. "We'll check if anything is left after everyone else has been served." Without waiting for a response, he guided Riley away, the tray vanishing with her. Zaire's stomach twisted. The flight attendants continued their rounds, setting down meals for every other passenger. The sound of cutlery meeting fine china became unbearable. Howard let out a satisfied sigh as he lifted the silver lid off his plate, revealing a perfectly cooked steak. "That's the problem with these last-minute upgrades," Howard mused, cutting into the meat with a deliberate slowness. "You never quite get the full experience." Lauren let out a soft hum of agreement, delicately spreading butter on a slice of bread. "Such a shame," she murmured. Zaire inhaled deeply through his nose. He knew what was happening, and so did they. The meal hadn't been forgotten. It had been removed. A calculated move meant to remind him that even when he sat among them, he would never be one of them. His throat felt dry, but when he reached for his cup of water, his fingers barely grazed the plastic before Derek accidentally bumped the tray, sending the cup tipping over. Water spilled across the small surface, seeping into the napkin and pooling near the edge. "Oh," Derek said, watching the liquid spread with mild disinterest. "You should be more careful." Zaire exhaled slowly, forcing his fingers to remain still. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a napkin, dabbing at the mess, feeling the way the damp fabric clung to his skin. Bryant passed by again, pausing just long enough to glance down at the mess. "Everything all right here?" His voice carried that same false politeness, but the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes was unmistakable. Lauren tilted her head. "I think he's having a bit of trouble adjusting." Howard smirked. "Understandable. It's not easy stepping into a world that's above your station." Zaire set down the soaked napkin, his fingers curling into a fist beneath the table. The inside of his cheek ached from how hard he was biting down, willing himself to stay silent. If he spoke, it would only make things worse. If he reacted, he would be branded as the problem. If he demanded his meal, his seat, his dignity, he would become the aggressor in their carefully constructed narrative. The worst part wasn't even the hunger. It was the understanding that every single thing happening to him was intentional. No one needed to raise their voice or point a finger. They had mastered the art of silent destruction. The plane remained in a steady hum, the occasional clinking of cutlery against plates a cruel reminder of the meal he had been denied. Across from him, Howard took his time with his steak, slicing it slowly, each movement deliberate. "You know," Howard mused, tilting his fork slightly as if deep in thought, "they say travel broadens a mind. But I imagine it must be overwhelming for someone who's never really experienced luxury before." Derek smirked, setting down his wine glass. "Overwhelming is a kind way to put it." Lauren sighed, wiping the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "He does look a little out of place, doesn't he?" She leaned slightly toward her husband, voice dipping just low enough to make it seem like she wasn't speaking for Zaire's benefit, but ensuring he could hear every word. "I keep wondering if he's actually enjoying himself, or if he's just trying to pretend he fits in." Howard chuckled, nodding toward Zaire's empty tray. "Doesn't look like he's enjoying much of anything." Bryant reappeared, strolling down the aisle with effortless authority. He paused at Zaire's row, glancing at the untouched cup of water, the crumpled napkin, the absence of a meal. "Not hungry?" His tone was neutral, almost pleasant, but the flicker in his gaze revealed the true intent behind the question. Zaire's throat tightened. He knew what Bryant wanted, to force him to acknowledge the humiliation, to see if he would break. He refused to give him the satisfaction. "I'm fine," he muttered, forcing the words out evenly. Bryant hummed an acknowledgement but made no move to leave. Instead, he turned his attention to Derek and Lauren. "Can I offer either of you anything else?" Lauren smiled, tilting her head slightly. "Oh, nothing for me, thank you. But I do wonder, does the airline still offer that wonderful chocolate souffle for dessert? I remember it being such a delightful treat last time." Bryant nodded. "Of course. I'll bring it right out." Howard smirked. "You know, I've always believed dessert tastes best when you earn it." The comment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Zaire stared at the screen in front of him, but the words burned into his skin like a brand. They weren't just excluding him anymore. They were making a spectacle of it. Minutes later, the flight attendants returned, carefully placing dessert trays in front of every business class passenger. Rich, decadent soufflés, topped with powdered sugar, sat neatly on porcelain plates, accompanied by delicate spoons and a garnish of fresh berries. The air filled with the scent of warm chocolate, the kind that made mouths water and stomachs tighten in anticipation. But no one touched their plates immediately. Instead, they waited, as if savoring the moment, not for themselves, but for the silent message it sent to the one person who didn't have a tray in front of him. Lauren delicately scooped a small bite onto her spoon, bringing it to her lips with exaggerated enjoyment. "MMM," she murmured, eyes fluttering shut for a second. "Absolutely divine. Wouldn't you agree?" Derek nodded, taking his time cutting through the soft center. Perfect texture. Howard took a slow bite, letting out a satisfied sigh. Nothing quite like a well-earned indulgence. Bryant passed by again, pausing just long enough to let his gaze linger on Zaire's empty space. He didn't say anything this time. He didn't need to. Zaire's fingers twitched against his lap, the tension in his shoulders unbearable. He hadn't eaten in hours, his stomach twisted in hunger, but this wasn't about food. This was about power. A quiet chuckle from across the aisle. "Poor kid," Howard said, setting down his spoon. "Looks like someone forgot to teach him how the world works." Lauren hummed in agreement, dabbing at her lips with a napkin. "Lesson learned, I suppose." Zaire's pulse pounded against his skull. His throat felt raw, his muscles coiled so tightly it hurt. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. If he did, they would win. If he showed even the slightest crack, they would pounce. Howard wiped the corner of his mouth with a napkin, leaning back in his seat with an air of finality. Well, he sighed contentedly. That was excellent. Lauren smiled, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. A sweet end to a perfect flight. Derek checked his watch. Still a few hours left. Though I suppose for some it must feel much longer. His eyes flicked to Zaire, a knowing smirk tugging at his lips. Zaire inhaled slowly, his fingers curling beneath the table, nails pressing into his skin. His breath was steady, but inside something shifted. He had taken everything they threw at him. Every insult, every calculated slight, every smug remark designed to strip him of his dignity. They thought they had broken him. They thought he had no power here. They were wrong. Without a word, Zaire reached into his pocket, his fingers wrapping around his phone. He unlocked the screen, his movements slow, deliberate. He scrolled to a single contact, typed out a short message, and pressed send. One word. Now. He set the phone down, face unreadable, and waited. At first, nothing changed. The cabin remained the same, the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the occasional laugh. Then, almost imperceptibly, the energy in the air shifted. A flight attendant's radio crackled softly near the galley. Bryant, standing near the front of the cabin, suddenly stiffened as his earpiece came to life. He turned slightly, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker, something close to unease. Howard noticed first. He raised an eyebrow, swirling the last remnants of his drink. Something wrong? Bryant didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, his shoulders a fraction tighter than before. Another call crackled through his earpiece, and this time, his jaw clenched slightly before he schooled his expression back into neutrality. Zaire remained still, gaze locked on the screen in front of him, but inside he felt it, the shift in balance, the unraveling of control. Then, the intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." We ask that all passengers remain seated as we conduct a brief operational check. We appreciate your cooperation. The tone was calm, professional, but beneath it lay something sharper, something absolute. Lauren frowned slightly, glancing toward Derek. That's strange. Howard's smirk faltered for the first time. An operational check? Bryant straightened his uniform, forcing a smile as he moved down the aisle. Nothing to be concerned about, he assured them smoothly. Just a standard procedure. But Zaire could see it now, the way Bryant's fingers twitched slightly, the way his posture wasn't quite as composed as before. The first cracks had formed. The shift was subtle at first. A flight attendant near the front of the cabin suddenly stood a little straighter, her demeanor more alert. Another near the galley exchanged a glance with a colleague, their conversation quiet but purposeful. A passenger in first class adjusted his cufflinks, his movements slow, deliberate. Howard noticed. What the hell's going on? He muttered, sitting up slightly. Then, the real blow landed. A voice, clear, authoritative, spoke from the front of the plane. Mr. Coleman. Zaire finally moved. He lifted his head, meeting the gaze of the first officer who had stepped into the cabin, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniable. Sir, the officer continued, on behalf of the airline, we apologize for the inconvenience. We'd like to extend an offer to move you to a more suitable seat for the remainder of the flight. The air in the cabin thickened. Howard's grip tightened around his glass. Derek's smirk vanished. Lauren's lips parted slightly, confusion flickering across her face. Bryant, for the first time since this flight began, looked truly unsettled. I wasn't made aware of any seating changes, he said carefully. The first officer turned to him, expression calm but firm. You weren't supposed to be. A flicker of something close to panic crossed Bryant's face before he quickly masked it. Zaire stood, the silence around him deafening. His movements were slow, controlled, a deliberate contrast to the whirlwind of tension now gripping the people around him. Howard's mouth opened, then closed. His fingers twitched like he wanted to say something, to object, to reassert control. But he didn't. He couldn't. Zaire turned, stepping toward the front of the plane, leaving them behind. And the moment he passed Bryant, he murmured, just loud enough for him to hear, "You should have checked who I was." Zaire moved forward, his steps slow, deliberate, a stark contrast to the growing tension suffocating the cabin behind him. Every fiber of his being told him not to look back, not to acknowledge the weight of the silence pressing into the seats he had just left. But he didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. He could feel it, the shift in power, the unraveling of their carefully constructed world. Howard gripped the armrest of his seat, his knuckles paling under the pressure. What the hell was that? His voice was low, sharp, almost desperate. Derek swallowed hard, his smirk long gone, replaced with something resembling unease. I don't know, he muttered. His fingers tapped against the tray table, his confidence cracking piece by piece. But I don't like it. Lauren's posture stiffened as she exchanged a glance with Bryant, her carefully composed elegance slipping. Who is he? Her voice was quieter now, edged with something unspoken, something dangerously close to fear. Bryant, for the first time since the flight began, had no response. His normally effortless composure faltered, his mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. He had spent the entire flight controlling the narrative, ensuring that Zaire remained powerless. Now, in mere minutes, he had lost all of it. The first officer led Zaire through the first-class cabin, where heads turned, passengers whispering amongst themselves. Some looked confused, others curious, but none carried the condescension that had smothered him in business class. The air here felt different, less suffocating, less tainted. A flight attendant near the cockpit stepped forward, nodding respectfully. Mr. Coleman, right this way. Her tone held none of the dismissiveness he had endured for hours. She gestured to an open seat, a private, spacious corner of first class, far removed from the venomous whispers he had left behind. Zaire sat down, sinking into the plush leather, feeling the tension in his muscles loosen for the first time since stepping onto the plane. A flight attendant placed a fresh meal in front of him, steak, roasted vegetables, a glass of chilled sparkling water. No delays, no excuses, just silent acknowledgement that this was what he had always been entitled to. Meanwhile, in business class, the reality of the situation was beginning to set in. Bryant still stood in place, as if frozen in time, processing the implications of what had just occurred. Howard exhaled sharply, shaking his head, his arrogance now replaced with something bitter. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Who does this kid think he is?" A voice interrupted him, not Zaire's, but from above. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The intercom crackled to life, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. "At this time, we would like to extend our sincerest apologies for any mistreatment experienced by one of our most valued passengers. We take matters of discrimination very seriously at this airline, and appropriate actions will be taken upon landing. Thank you for your cooperation." Howard's fingers curled into a fist, his jaw tightening. Lauren's face paled, her breath catching in her throat. Derek leaned forward, his mouth slightly open as if trying to process what he had just heard. But it was Bryant who suffered the biggest blow. His stomach twisted as the last shred of his authority crumbled beneath him. Howard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tightening around the armrest. The weight of the captain's announcement still hung heavy in the air, suffocating, inescapable. Lauren sat frozen, her poised elegance shattered, her carefully crafted superiority reduced to nothing. Derek's fingers tapped against the tray table, his usual confidence now a ghost of what it once was. But no one looked as broken as Bryant. The flight attendant stood stiffly, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask. But beneath it, Zaire could see the truth. The man who had spent the entire flight controlling the narrative, who had relished in making Zaire feel small, now stood at the mercy of forces far beyond his control. A sudden movement near the front of a cabin drew their attention. Two senior airline officials, both dressed in sharp Navy uniforms, stepped inside from the cockpit area. Their expressions were neutral, professional, but their presence alone sent a clear message. One of them leaned toward Bryant, whispering something that made the older man stiffen even further. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, Bryant stepped aside, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. A second later, one of the officials turned toward the business class passengers. "Mr. Calloway, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," his voice was smooth, controlled, but carried an underlying finality upon landing. "We will need you to remain seated for further discussion regarding your conduct on this flight." Lauren inhaled sharply, color draining from her face. "Excuse me?" Derek frowned, sitting forward slightly. "This is absurd. We didn't do anything. You will remain seated," the official repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Howard let out a sharp breath, frustration flickering across his face, but he knew better than to argue further. The power that had once been theirs was gone, stripped away in an instant. And Zaire? He didn't need to say a word. He sat in first class, his meal finished, his expression calm as he leaned back against the soft leather, watching as the same people who had spent the entire flight humiliating him now sat in silent dread, awaiting their fate. Minutes passed, stretching into eternity. The plane began its descent, the automated voice announcing their approach. Outside the window, the city lights sparkled beneath them, but inside the cabin, there was no conversation, no smug laughter, only the crushing weight of impending consequences. The moment the wheels touched the ground, the tension reached its peak. The usual rustling of passengers preparing to disembark was absent. No one in business class moved. The doors opened, and instead of passengers flooding out, security personnel stepped in. "Mr. Sterling," one of them addressed Bryant. "You'll be coming with us." Bryant exhaled shakily, his jaw tight, his composure cracking for the first time. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply nodded, his fate sealed. Howard let out a slow breath, his confidence shattered. Lauren refused to meet anyone's gaze. Derek clenched his fists, his indignation meaningless now. Zaire watched as one by one they were escorted off the plane, not as elite passengers, not as people who had controlled the space around them, but as individuals stripped of their status, forced to answer for what they had done. As he stood to leave, a quiet voice stopped him. "Mr. Coleman." Zaire turned. The captain stood near the exit, his expression unreadable, but his words carried weight. "On behalf of the airline, we sincerely apologize. This should never have happened." Zaire nodded once, accepting the apology, but he didn't need it. He had already won. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, the world outside felt different, lighter, freer. He had walked onto this plane as someone they believed they could break. He walked off knowing they would never forget his name, and neither would the world. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. What was the most shocking moment for you? How would you have reacted if you were in Zaire's position? Let us know in the comments below. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world.